Let's set the scene for one of the boldest and most iconic acts of defiance in American history, the Boston Tea Party. Picture this moment not just as history, but as the opening act of a revolutionary drama. Welcome back to Irregular Mind. Thanks for joining with me again in this journey through history. Last time, we stopped at the rising tensions between Britain and the colonies, leading up to the infamous Boston Massacre. Today, we pick up with the bold defiance of Boston Tea Party, a pivotal act that sent shockwaves across the Atlantic and set the colonies on the path towards independence. Before we start, a quick note. If you are enjoying this podcast, please follow, rate, and share Irregular Mind. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's step into the night of December 16th, 1773, where revolution brewed in the icy waters of Boston Harbor. A freezing winter wind sweeps through the bustling port of Boston. The city is a powder keg of tension. The colonial boycott of British goods has been in full swing for years, and Parliament's stubborn insistence on tax on tea, which is left over from the Townshend Acts, has become a bitter symbol of oppression. The East India Company, struggling financially and burdened with unsold tea, had been granted a monopoly by Britain. The Tea Act of 1773 allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants but still including the hated tax. To the British, this was a clever solution. To the colonists, it was a slap in the face, a blatant attempt to force them into submission. In Boston, 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored in the harbor, their holds packed with tea. For weeks, colonists had demanded the tea be sent back to Britain. The royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, refused. The deadline was looming. If the tea wasn't unloaded and tax paid, the cargo would be confiscated by the crown. But the Sons of Liberty had some other plan. Now picture this. A crowded meeting at the Old South Meeting House where thousands of colonists gather, their voices echoing off the wooden beams. Samuel Adams, the fiery leader of Sons of Liberty, rises to speak. His words ignite the crowd like sparks to dry tinder. As the sun sets and the harbor darkens, a group of men slips away from the meeting, disguising themselves as Mohawk warriors, their faces painted and their identities hidden. It's not about deception. It is about making a statement. If they are going to break the law, they are going to do it boldly, in a way no one will forget. By the time they reach the wharf, the harbor is silent except for the creaking of ship masts swaying in the icy wind. The men boarded the ship swiftly and efficiently. This isn't a chaotic mob, it's a calculated act of rebellion. With axes in hand, they break open the crates of tea and the fragrant leaves spilling into the cold air. One by one, the chests are thrown into the harbor, their contents swallowed by the freezing black water. In total, 342 chests of tea worth thousands of pounds are destroyed. As the men work, onlookers watch in stunned silence. Not a single crate of cargo is taken for personal gain. This is not theft, it's a statement. By dawn, the harbor is a frothy, briny mix of salt water and ruined tea leaves. The colonists have sent a message that will reverberate across the Atlantic. We will not be taxed without representation. We will not be controlled. We will not back down. Back in Britain, the news of Boston Tea Party is met with outrage. To Parliament, this is an act of treason. King George III and his ministers see it as a challenge to their authority that cannot go unanswered. What follows is a series of harsh measures known as the Intolerable Acts, designed to punish Boston and bring the colonies back into line. But instead of breaking the colonies' spirit, these acts only strengthened their resolve. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just a protest, it was the tipping point. It showed the world that the American colonies were no longer just speaking out against injustice, they were willing to fight for their freedom. The harbor may have been still and silent that night in December, but the ripples of the defiance spread far and wide, becoming a tidal wave of revolution. And as Parliament clamps down with the intolerable acts, the colonists begin to take the next step towards unity, rebellion, and independence. To British, the destruction of tea wasn't just a protest, it was outright rebellion. King George III, no longer willing to tolerate colonial defiance, declared the colonies must either submit or triumph. And so, Parliament passed a series of laws designing to punish the Boston and bringing the colonies back under control. Officially, they were called coercive acts, but in the colonies, they earned a far more fitting name, the Intolerable Acts. Boston, once a bustling port city, was the epicenter of the colonial resistance. Parliament's first move was to strike at its heart with the Boston Port Act. This law closed the port of Boston entirely, cutting off trade and strangling the city's economy. Ships could neither enter nor leave until the East India Company has repaid for the destroyed tea. For a city that depended on commerce, this was a devastating blow. But it didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act followed. It dismantled the colony's charter and stripping its citizens of their rights to self-govern. Town meetings, the bedrock of New England democracy, were severely restricted, and the king's appointees now held the reins of power. To the colonies, this wasn't just punishment, it was tyranny. Then came the Administration of Justice Act, which colonies dubbed as Murder Act. It allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in England, where they were more likely to receive a sympathetic verdict. To the colonies, this act felt like a free pass to British soldiers and officials to act with impunity, knowing they wouldn't face justice in America. And finally, the Quartering Act, which forced colonists to house and feed British soldiers, even in private homes if necessary. Imagine having a redcoat stationed in your home, watching your every move, a constant reminder of British authority. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. But the Intolerable Acts didn't stop at Massachusetts. Another law, the Quebec Act, extended the boundaries of Quebec into the Ohio Valley and granted freedom of religion to Catholics in the region. While this wasn't technically part of coercive acts, it enraged the Protestant colonists and was seen as yet another affront to their autonomy and beliefs. The Intolerable Acts were meant to isolate Massachusetts to make an example of Boston and deter the other colonies from following its rebellious path. But instead of breaking the colonies apart, these measures brought them closer together. The punishment of one colony became the outrage of all. Colonial leaders convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774 to coordinate a unified response. Delegates from across the colonies gathered to discuss their grievances and chart a path forward. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, called for a boycott of British goods, and began laying the groundwork for what would soon become a revolutionary movement. The Intolerable Acts were meant to crush the spirit of rebellion, but they had the opposite effect. They united the colonies in their defiance and pushed them closer to open resistance. The stage was set. Tensions were high, the colonies were organizing, and the fires of revolution were burning brighter than ever. And soon, those fires would ignite into conflict, beginning with the famous cry, "The British are coming." April 18, 1775. The cool spring air hangs heavy with tension as the towns of Massachusetts settle into the quiet of night. Little do they know their lives are about to change forever. In Boston, British troops are on the move. Their mission? To march to Concord, seize colonial weapons, and arrest revolutionary leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the colonists are ready. Thanks to a network of spies, the Sons of Liberty have caught wind of the plan. The revolution isn't waiting for the British, it is already brewing. This is where we meet Paul Revere, a silversmith, patriot, and a member of the Sons of Liberty. Revere is no stranger to danger. He knows that this night will determine the fate of revolution. His task was to warn the countryside that British regulars are advancing. It begins with a signal. 2 lanterns hung in the steeple of Boston's Old North Church. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. The British are crossing the Charles River by boat, and Revere sets off on horseback, galloping into the night. As he rides, Revere doesn't yell, "The British are coming." That's a myth. Most colonists still considered themselves British at this point. Instead, he shouts a more practical warning. "The regulars are out." His words echo through the stillness, rousing the local militias and alerting households to approaching danger. Revere isn't alone in this midnight mission. Other riders include William Dawes and Dr. Samuel Prescott, joined the effort spreading the alarm across Middlesex County. Together, they ensure that the colonial militias, known as the Minutemen, are ready when the British troops arrive. Revere's ride is not without peril. As he approaches Lexington, British patrols spot him and briefly capture him, but his warning has already done its job. The Minutemen are awake, armed, and ready. By the early hours of April 19th, the British troops arrive in Lexington to find the colonists waiting for them. It's here, on the village green, that the first shots of American Revolution are fired. No one knows who fired the first shot. The shot heard around the world, but it marks the beginning of a war that will change the history forever. Paul Revere's midnight ride became the symbol of revolutionary courage and urgency. It wasn't just about one man on horseback, it was about the colonies standing together, ready to fight for their freedom. This was more than a warning cry, it was the sound of a new nation being born. Let us take a step back and look at what happened in the First Continental Congress. The year was 1774. The colonies were in turmoil after the passage of Intolerable Acts, the Britain's heavy-handed response to the Boston Tea Party. These punitive measures were designed to isolate Massachusetts, but instead, they united the colonies in a shared sense of injustice. It was clear that something had to be done, and for the first time, representatives from 12 of 13 colonies gathered to discuss their collective future. Georgia held back. On September 5th of 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, a city chosen for its central location. Delegates included some of the most prominent figures in colonial America: John Adams, Samuel Adams, George Washington, Patrick Henry, and John Jay among them. The mood was serious but uncertain. These men weren't calling for independence. Instead, they hoped to resolve these grievances with Britain peacefully. They drafted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a document that affirmed their loyalty to the Crown but firmly rejected Parliament's right to tax or legislate for the colonies without representation. The Congress also agreed to implement a boycott of British goods, uniting the colonies in economic resistance. This was no small decision. Many delegates were merchants themselves who stood to lose personally from such a measure. But the spirit of unity and defiance outweighed their individual concerns. Perhaps most importantly, the First Continental Congress set the stage for greater cooperation. They agreed to reconvene if their demands were not met, paving the way of the Second Continental Congress, where the fight for independence would truly begin. The First Continental Congress marked a critical moment in American history. It showed that the colonies, despite their differences, would come together to stand against a common threat. It was the first step towards becoming a united nation. When the colonies were on the brink of revolution, and one voice captured the spirit of defiance like no one other: Patrick Henry. It's March 23, 1775. The Virginia's leaders are gathered at St. John's Church in Richmond for the Virginia Convention. The debate is heated. The question on the table: should Virginia prepare for war against Britain or not? The mood in the room is divided. Many still hope for reconciliation with the Crown, believing that peace is still possible. But Patrick Henry, with his fiery passion and sharp words, has had enough of waiting. He rises to speak, and the room falls silent. Henry's speech is electric. He lays out the case for immediate action, arguing that all attempts to compromise have failed and that the time has come to fight for freedom. His words crescendo to the now legendary climax. Quote, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Unquote. The room is stunned. Henry's words cut through doubt and hesitation, galvanizing those who hear him. His call to arms becomes a rallying cry not just for Virginia but for all the colonies. This moment crystallized the growing realization that liberty and British rule could no longer coexist. Patrick Henry's speech wasn't just a call for war. It was a declaration of the values the colonies were willing to fight for and even to die for. The Sons of Liberty, the secretive and fearless patriots, were once again taking action to defy British rule. The Sons of Liberty had already made their mark with acts like the Boston Tea Party. But their work didn't stop there. As tensions escalated in 1774 and 1775, this underground network intensified its efforts to disrupt British authority and rally the colonies to the cause of independence. In Massachusetts, the Sons began stockpiling weapons and ammunition in preparation for what they saw as an inevitable conflict. They established secret communication networks to coordinate efforts between towns and colonies, ensuring that any British move would be met with swift resistance. One of their boldest acts came in response to the Intolerable Acts. British officials tried to enforce their harsh laws by shutting down local governments and taking direct control. The Sons of Liberty responded by organizing secret town meetings, publishing underground newspapers, and spreading propaganda to keep the spirit of resistance alive. In New York, the Sons led boycott of British goods, turning public opinion against the merchants who continued to trade with the crown. They weren't afraid to use intimidation tactics, tarring and feathering loyalists or disrupting British efforts with acts of sabotage. Their efforts were far from random. The Sons of Liberty understood the power of symbolism and spectacle. Every protest, every pamphlet, every act of defiance was carefully calculated to inspire others and send a clear message to Britain. The colonies would not be subdued. As the Sons of Liberty worked tirelessly in the shadows, they set the stage for open conflict. Their bold actions and unyielding commitment to freedom inspired countless others to join the cause. When the first shot of revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, it was clear that their work had been a success. The colonies were ready to fight. On April 19, 1775, the early morning light is still breaking over the fields of Lexington, Massachusetts, and tension hangs thick in the air. British troops, nearly 700 strong, marched towards Concord with orders to seize colonial weapons and arrest key leaders like John Hancock and Samuel Adams. But thanks to Paul Revere's midnight ride and the effort of other messengers, the Minutemen are ready. On the village green of Lexington, a small group of 77 colonial Minutemen stands their ground. They are outnumbered and outgunned, but their determination is unshakable. The British troops, led by Major John Pitcairn, ordered them to disperse. For a moment, it seems they might obey. Then it happens. No one knows who fired the first shot. It could have been a British soldier or a nervous militiaman. But the single shot, known as the shot heard around the world, changes everything. Chaos erupts. When the smoke clears, 8 colonists lie dead and the British march on to Concord. At Concord, the British find themselves facing an even larger and more organized force of Minutemen. The colonists have hidden their weapons and are ready to fight. At the North Bridge, the Minutemen fired back, forcing the British to retreat. The British march back to Boston is a nightmare. Along the way, colonial militias ambush them, firing from behind trees, fences, and stone walls. By the end of the day, British suffer over 250 casualties, while the colonists lose fewer than 100. Lexington and Concord were in large-scale battles, but they were monumental in their impact. They marked the first open conflict between the colonies and Britain, proving that the colonists were willing to fight and die for their liberty. And that was the episode, folks. But the story is far from over. In our next episode, we will pick up with the Second Continental Congress, where the colonies begin to lay the foundation for independence. From the creation of Continental Army to the leadership of George Washington, the revolution takes its next dramatic step. If you are enjoying Irregular Mind, please take a moment to follow, rate, and share this podcast. Your support helps us bring these stories to more curious minds like yours. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time as we continue with this incredible journey through history.